Why nutrition science isn't settled and never was. Dum 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 dum. Those are fighting words for a dietitian, but there's some truth to it. So today I'm reacting to a podcast interview with Carnivore JT, Jason, who's been living a carnivore or a cyclical carnivore lifestyle for about 3 years. His host is also carnivore, so this is very much an inside the community conversation, which means I want to bring some outside perspective. There's genuinely interesting stuff here and some things I agree with, and a few places where I want to add nuance. Let's get into it. Jason's entry into carnivore is actually a pretty common story. He did Whole30, which is essentially a clean Mediterranean style elimination diet, lost weight, but it felt miserable, had no energy, hated the food, and immediately regained the weight back when he stopped. Then he tried animal-based eating somewhat loosely, felt better almost immediately, and gradually tightened it up to full carnivore. From a dietitian standpoint, there are a few things worth unpacking here. First, the Whole30 experience he describes, feeling tired, low energy, no real sense of improvement, is something I hear often, and it's worth asking why. For some people, a very high fiber, plant-heavy diet causes real digestive discomfort and bloating. For others, the dramatic reduction in calories that often comes with clean eating creates fatigue. And for some, removing processed foods cold turkey triggers withdrawal-like response from sugar and hyperpalatable foods. None of those experiences mean vegetables are bad. They often reflect what was removed rather than what was added. His experience, feeling better on animal-based eating, is real and valid. But it's worth noting that he also simultaneously removed ultra-processed foods, alcohol most of the time, and most refined carbohydrates. Now, attributing all of the benefits specifically to eating more animal products rather than to the removal of those other things is where it gets complicated to untangle. His concept of cyclical carnivore, using strict carnivore as a home base and returning to it when he drifts, this is actually a pretty reasonable framework for someone who has found what works for them. The idea that your diet should have a clearly defined reset point is something I genuinely appreciate. A lot of people have no North Star when things go off course, and that's where weight regain and metabolic drift happen. His point about metabolic flexibility is worth engaging with seriously. Being able to go several hours without eating without becoming shaky, anxious, or cognitively impaired is a legitimate marker of good metabolic health. When blood sugar regulation is healthy and you're able to oxidize fat as a fuel source effectively, you're not dependent on constant glucose replenishment. That's real and desirable. What I'd add is that metabolic flexibility isn't exclusive to carnivore or ketogenic eating. It's achievable through any dietary pattern that controls refined carbohydrate and sugar intake, prioritizes protein and fiber, and is paired with regular physical activity and adequate sleep. So carnivore is one path to it, it's not the only one. So then they have the LDL conversation, and this is where I'd pump the brakes. This is the section that requires the most careful handling because Jason and his host dismiss elevated LDL cholesterol as essentially meaningless, citing the ability to manipulate LDL levels by eating white bread before a blood draw, which references Dave Feldman's protocol and Nick Norwitz's Oreo study. I want to be fair here because there's legitimate scientific debate about LDL, particularly about particle size, the context of overall metabolic health, and whether LDL elevation in the absence of other risk factors carries the same cardiovascular risk as LDL elevation in someone with insulin resistance, high triglycerides, and low LDL. Those are real and ongoing discussions in the research community. But the conclusion they land on, which is essentially I'm not worried about my LDL at all, goes further than the evidence supports in my view. The ability to temporarily lower LDL by eating refined carbohydrates before a blood draw is a real phenomenon, but it doesn't tell us anything about long-term cardiovascular risk. LDL manipulation through diet doesn't change the underlying biology of arterial plaque formation over decades. What I would say is this. LDL in isolation is an incomplete picture, and Jason is right that triglycerides and HDL ratio, fasting insulin, inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein and apolipoprotein B are all far more informative than LDL alone. His HOMA-IR score, it looks like HOMA-IR score on paper, and fasting glucose of 79 suggests genuinely excellent insulin sensitivity. That context matters. But dismissing LDL entirely, especially at elevated levels over the long term, is a more confident position than the current evidence justifies for most people. Okay, so then they talk about eating a carnivore diet and mental health. And here's what the evidence actually says. So the claim that carnivore has helped people with schizophrenia, psychotic episodes, and severe institutional mental illness is the most provocative part of this video. Jason says he's spoken to multiple people personally who got their lives back through carnivore after years of failed psychiatric medication. I want to handle this carefully. There is a growing and genuinely interesting body of research on ketogenic and low carbohydrate diets and mental health. Researchers like Dr. Georgia Ede and the Metabolic Mind Group are doing real work here, and there are ongoing clinical trials. The biological rationale that brain glucose metabolism is impaired in certain psychiatric conditions and that ketones may provide an alternative fuel source has mechanistic plausibility. But here's where I'd urge caution. Anecdotes, even compelling ones, are not evidence of population level efficacy. The people who experience dramatic improvement and are telling their stories online are not representative of everyone who tries carnivore for mental health. Survivorship bias is powerful. The people for whom it didn't work aren't making YouTube videos about it. More importantly, anyone managing schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or psychosis with medication should never modify or discontinue their treatment based on social media content without working closely with a psychiatrist. Stopping psychiatric medication abruptly can be genuinely dangerous. The message "you might get better if you just ate carnivore," while well-intentioned, needs to be paired with a very clear, and please do this with medical supervision, that isn't consistently present in these conversations. The research direction is interesting. The certainty with which these claims are made is not yet warranted by evidence. Okay, so the 30 grams of protein per meal myth, as discussed in the video that I'm reviewing. This one is actually a case where I agree with Jason more than I disagree, and he handles it well. The long-standing claim that you can only absorb 30 grams of protein per meal is not well supported. The body doesn't have a hard ceiling on protein absorption. It processes what it receives, and higher doses simply take longer to absorb and may sustain muscle protein synthesis for longer periods. The research he references is directionally accurate. His evolutionary logic, how would we have survived if we could have only 4 ounces of protein at a time, is a bit informal as an argument, but the underlying point about the body's capacity to utilize protein across a meal is supported by more rigorous research, including the work of Dr. Jorn Tromelin and colleagues, showing that protein synthesis remained elevated longer with larger protein doses. So, Jason's advice on ultra-processed food. His final answer for that most important thing he'd tell his 20-year-old self is to stop eating ultra-processed food. Is probably the most broadly applicable and least controversial thing in this entire video. The evidence linking ultra-processed food consumption to obesity, metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, and even mental health outcomes is among the strongest we have in nutrition science. Whatever dietary framework you follow, reducing ultra-processed food is a recommendation I can stand behind unequivocally. Overall, Jason comes across as thoughtful, self-aware, and genuinely motivated by helping people. His personal results are real. His framework of using carnivore as a metabolic reset tool has practical logic to it, and his emphasis on metabolic flexibility, insulin sensitivity, and ultra-processed food is well-grounded. Where I'd encourage viewers to think critically is around the LDL dismissal, the certainty around carnivore and severe mental illness, and the framing that carnivore is uniquely responsible for benefits that may partly come from the removal of poor quality food rather than the addition of animal products specifically. If you're curious about carnivore or animal-based eating and want to know whether it might be right for your situation, that's exactly the kind of personalized conversation we have in the Real Talk Continuum. Link is in the description. Drop your questions below, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.